You could feel the tension the second she walked in. The federal courtroom was packed. Journalists whispering in the back, camera crews scrambling, and political insiders watching nervously from the shadows. At the center of it all, Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, not standing behind a podium this time, but walking into court as the lead prosecutor in one of the most explosive cases the country has seen in years. She wasn't here to spin headlines. She was here to bring down Hawk Enterprises, a powerful criminal syndicate accused of fueling an epidemic of death and corruption, trafficking drugs, bribing politicians, and even infecting the bench of justice itself. And that's where the moment happened. As Judge Harold Sinclair entered the room, the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." Everyone stood, cameras clicked, suits straightened. Everyone, except Karoline Leavitt. She didn't flinch. Arms crossed, jaw locked, her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I don't stand for those who sell justice." The room froze. The judge stiffened. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like shockwaves. And then, in a moment no one saw coming, Karoline stepped forward. And what she did next turned the trial into a full-blown political earthquake. This wasn't just about exposing a drug empire. It was about exposing a system that protected it. And Karoline Leavitt? She just lit the match. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and make sure to hit subscribe, because what happened next? You won't believe it until you see it. As we know well, the federal courtroom was a cathedral of power, its towering columns, high wooden benches, and gleaming brass seals silently imposing their weight on all who entered. But on this particular morning, the solemn stillness had been replaced by a palpable tension that gripped the air like a vice. Rows of press, legal observers, and concerned citizens packed every available seat. Cameras were rolling. Murmurs swirled. Something was about to happen. Something that, many sensed, would be remembered. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice thundered through the chamber like a strike of gavel on steel. In unison, the room stood, except for one. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, sat still, rigid, composed, and unflinching. Her hands rested calmly on the table before her, her gaze fixed, not at the ceiling, not at her notes, but directly, unwaveringly at the man ascending the bench. Judge Harold Sinclair. A towering man with silver hair and a reputation forged in fear, Sinclair had sat on the federal bench for over 30 years. Revered in elite legal circles, his rulings had long tilted in favor of entrenched power. Corporate conglomerates, establishment politicians, and bureaucratic insiders. Publicly, he was heralded for his discipline and discretion. Privately, he was whispered to be something else entirely. Sinclair took his seat with mechanical authority, barely glancing at the woman who remained seated. A few gasps escaped from the gallery. His gavel did not yet fall, but his pride already had. The pause was long, calculated, designed to send a message. "Ms. Leavitt," he finally intoned, voice thick with disdain, "in this courtroom, we observe respect. You will stand." Karoline didn't blink. Her reply came steady, deliberate. "I respect the law, Your Honor, but I will not stand for corruption masquerading as justice." Gasps erupted like a dam breaking. One woman in the back clutched her purse to her chest. A man in the front row, likely a veteran, based on the faded cap atop his head, stood straighter, mouth agape. Sinclair's face flushed a mottled red. "You're in contempt," he growled, voice tight with fury. "Do you understand what that means, Ms. Leavitt?" Karoline turned ever so slightly to the cameras. Her voice rose, not with rebellion, but with resolve. "I understand it means telling the truth comes with a price. I'm willing to pay it." In living rooms across the country, thousands of eyes were locked on screens. But in one quiet house in Des Moines, Iowa, 82-year-old Margaret Walters sat forward in her recliner, her hands shaking as she clutched her late husband's military service medal. "She's doing it," she whispered to no one in particular. "She's saying what we've all felt for years." Beside her, a framed photo of her late husband in uniform caught the morning light. Margaret's eyes welled with tears, not from sadness, but from a long-awaited sense of recognition. He fought for truth. She's fighting for it now. Back in the courtroom, Sinclair's gavel finally fell. Hard. "This is not a stage for political theater," he barked. Caroline's head tilted slightly. "No, Your Honor, it's a courtroom. But justice hasn't lived here in a very long time." The room erupted. Some gasped, others murmured in awe. A few even applauded before a bailiff raised his hand to silence them. "Order!" Sinclair roared. "I'll have silence, or I will clear this courtroom." Reporters scrambled to transcribe every word. Camera operators zoomed in close, and somewhere in the chaos, a story that had been brewing quietly beneath the surface finally erupted into full view. And it was far from over. Weeks before the storm erupted in court, Karoline Leavitt had been quietly connecting the dots. It had started with a feeling, one she couldn't shake. Judge Harold Sinclair's rulings were always precise, but recently they had become suspiciously predictable. Class action lawsuits against pharmaceutical giants were dismissed before reaching trial. Whistleblowers found their cases thrown out on technicalities. Multi-million-dollar settlements vanished into sealed agreements that buried evidence and gagged the victims. To most, these were legal maneuvers. To Karoline, they were red flags. So she dug, and what she found was damning. Late at night, in her Washington apartment, while her newborn slept in the next room, Karoline pored over court records, corporate disclosures, and encrypted leaks sent by anonymous sources. Emails, bank transfers, photos. It began with a string of real estate investments, properties tied to Sinclair's son-in-law, whose name curiously appeared in shell company filings linked to multinational defense contractors. Then came digital footprints showing Sinclair had been in private communication with CEOs whose cases he would later preside over. But the true tipping point wasn't in the data. It was human. An elderly couple, Joe and Linda Carter from Scranton, Pennsylvania, had reached out to Karoline after hearing her speak at a town hall. They had lost their only son, Matthew, a firefighter and father of 3, to a tragic equipment malfunction during a rescue mission. The breathing apparatus he wore, manufactured by a company previously sued for producing defective gear, only for the case to be dismissed under Sinclair's gavel. "He didn't just take our son," Joe had said, gripping Karoline's hand tightly, his voice thick with grief. "He stole our faith in justice." Linda nodded silently, a photo of Matthew clutched between her fingers. "You can't grieve properly when no one's held accountable." Karoline had sat with them for hours. She asked questions. She listened. And when she left their small home, she left not just with their story, but with a renewed resolve. From that moment forward, it wasn't just about uncovering corruption. It was about honoring Matthew. It was about defending families like the Carters. And it was about restoring something far greater than reputation. It was about restoring faith. Behind the scenes, Karoline worked with trusted legal analysts and transparency watchdogs. She mapped connections between Sinclair and lobbying groups, pinpointed judicial timelines that aligned with suspicious stock trades, and interviewed multiple court clerks, one of whom confessed that Sinclair had demanded specific phrasing in case dismissals to avoid media scrutiny. "I couldn't take it anymore," the clerk said, voice trembling. "He made me delete files that showed the truth. I felt like I was hiding bodies." With the help of whistleblower protections, Karoline ensured their testimony would be heard. But she knew the media wouldn't run with it until it exploded publicly. So she prepared for court. She wasn't scheduled to speak that day. She hadn't planned to make a scene. But when Sinclair entered, flanked by arrogance and entitlement, she knew the moment had come. The moment to light the match has coming. To let the whole nation see not just a powerful judge, but a man wrapped in darkness, whose robes no longer symbolized justice, but concealed something far more sinister. She remembered the Carters, their trembling hands, their broken hearts, and she remembered the silence that followed Matthew's death. Sinclair had buried the truth in paperwork. Karoline would unearth it in daylight. And moment of truth. Now! The gavel came down again, this time with fury. "Ms. Leavitt!" Judge Sinclair's voice echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. "Apologize immediately, or you will be fined, removed, and possibly imprisoned for contempt." The room froze. Every reporter held their breath. Every camera zoomed in tighter. The American flag behind Sinclair almost looked like it was holding its own breath, waiting to see what she'd do next. Karoline slowly rose to her feet, not trembling, not frantic, calm, controlled, radiating the kind of strength that isn't rehearsed, but born of truth. "I will apologize," she said, her voice level. Sinclair's expression twisted into a sneer of victory. He leaned back in his chair, but Karoline wasn't done. "I will apologize," she repeated, "to the American people, for the fact that this courtroom has become a shrine to deceit and that justice has been sold to the highest bidder." Gasps exploded throughout the room like a bursting dam. Even a few jurors blinked in disbelief. Somewhere in the gallery, a veteran slowly removed his hat and held it over his heart. Karoline reached into her bag and retrieved a small black USB drive. She walked to the bailiff's desk, her heels clicking against the floor like a metronome, counting down to history, and handed over the drive. This contains sealed financial records, wire transfers, and encrypted communications linking Judge Harold Sinclair to offshore bank accounts and high-ranking CEOs whose cases he has ruled on. "No!" Sinclair stood up abruptly, knocking over a glass of water that splashed onto his documents. "This is illegal. You can't present that in this courtroom." "I just did," Karoline said, her tone unwavering. The courtroom murmured louder now, journalists feverishly texting, typing, and whispering. Sinclair banged his gavel again. "This is a mockery of due process. You have no legal standing, no jurisdiction to submit this." Karoline turned to face him, and the nation. "I have something stronger than legal standing," she said. "I have the truth, and the authority given to me by every American who has watched someone like you turn their tragedy into your profit." A murmur of amen rose from the back row. From Florida to Texas, from living rooms in Michigan to nursing homes in Arizona, elderly Americans were glued to their screens. The broadcast had gone viral. Even local channels interrupted programming to stream the footage. On one split screen, Karoline stood boldly. On the other, Sinclair fumed like a volcano losing control. Margaret Walters, the 82-year-old from Iowa, sat watching with her hand over her heart. Her husband's folded flag from his military funeral rested on her lap. "She's not just speaking for her generation," Margaret whispered. "She's speaking for mine." In Virginia, retired Navy Chief Raymond Barnes wiped his eyes. "I haven't seen courage like that since I served," he said aloud to no one, before rising from his recliner and saluting the screen. Back in court, the judge attempted to regain control. "This is a breach of judicial conduct and a gross misuse of courtroom protocol." Karoline looked him square in the eye. "Your Honor," she said, the words cutting with precision, "you don't get to lecture anyone about conduct. Not when families grieve because of rulings you sold to corporate devils. Not when justice lies bleeding behind that bench." Silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but filled with consequence. Sinclair was trembling now, gripping the armrest of his chair. Not from age, from fear. Karoline walked back to her seat slowly, deliberately. The gavel did not fall again. It had lost its meaning, because power in that moment had shifted. The storm didn't wait for the courtroom doors to close. Within 2 hours, Sinclair's allies launched a vicious media counteroffensive. Slick headlines on legacy outlets barked out the spin. "Karoline Leavitt crosses the line. Justice undermined." "Unhinged press secretary turns courtroom into circus." "Dangerous precedent. Leavitt weaponizes whistleblower evidence." Political commentators, law professors, and polished anchors lined up in neat rows on primetime to denounce her. Talking heads regurgitated carefully scripted outrage. "This is reckless. She's a provocateur. This smells like a political stunt." But they weren't speaking to America, because America had already seen the truth, and they remembered what it felt like. And when the storm hit Karoline's family, that's when the fire truly ignited. Her husband, who had remained quietly supportive, received anonymous death threats. Her parents were harassed with late-night calls from blocked numbers. A warning was spray-painted on her childhood home's mailbox. "Drop it or else." But Karoline didn't blink. She did what few have the courage to do in moments like this. She stepped forward. That evening, she released a public video. It was raw, unedited, and direct to camera. She sat in a modest room, her infant son sleeping just off frame, and spoke. "I know what fear feels like," she began, her voice calm but steeled with purpose. "But I also know what silence costs. I will not be intimidated, not for me, not for my family, and certainly not for the countless Americans who can't afford attorneys, who don't have platforms, and who have watched our legal system fail them over and over again." Across the country, comments poured in by the thousands. "She's braver than anyone in D.C. I'm a 77-year-old vet. I fought for this country. Today I fight for her. She is what truth looks like." Then came the turning point. From Tennessee to California, a grassroots movement took form, fueled not by campaign funds or political parties, but by emotion, memory, and moral clarity. Veterans for Justice was born overnight. Dozens, then hundreds of former servicemen and women organized rallies. They wore faded uniforms, walked with canes, carried oxygen tanks, but their signs were bold and their message was clear. "We stand with Karoline. Truth doesn't retire. Judge the judge." A video went viral. A 93-year-old World War II veteran named George Blake, standing with trembling hands and tears in his eyes. His voice cracked as he spoke. "My wife died in a hospital that cut corners for profit. The lawsuit was dismissed by Judge Sinclair in 2019. I never thought I'd see justice. But that young woman, she gave me hope again." George raised a sign with shaky arms. It read, "Karoline, you spoke for us." Social media exploded. Hashtags surged. "Rewrote justice for the people." "Stand with Karoline. Your judicial corruption exposed in Sinclair." His legal team doubled down. They filed an emergency injunction to block the release of the USB data. They issued press releases denying every allegation. They claimed Karoline was emotionally unstable and a danger to courtroom order. But it was too late, because justice had a face now, and it looked a lot like the granddaughter of a truck mechanic from New Hampshire who refused to sit down when it mattered most. The rain had been falling all morning in Washington, steady, soaking, relentless. It was the kind of rain that had driven people indoors. But in one place, the federal courthouse, people stood outside shoulder to shoulder, soaked to the bone. Not because they had to be there, because they wanted to be. Inside, the nation waited for the final act. Karoline Leavitt entered the courtroom not as a witness, not as an accuser, but as a truth bearer. She was composed as always, but there was something else today, something unmistakable. Not defiance, certainty. Behind her, the gallery was filled with faces weathered by age, lined by loss, but bright with anticipation. Some wore military caps. Others wore simple pins that read, "Justice isn't retired." As Karoline reached the center, she placed 3 small items on the evidence table. A set of flash drives, a stack of verified, certified, government-authenticated banking records, a single manila envelope, unmarked, sealed, sacred. She looked to the judge, not Sinclair, but a temporary replacement appointed after Sinclair's emergency recusal, a woman known for her impartiality and integrity. "Your Honor," Karoline began, her voice rich with purpose, "what I present today is not theory, not speculation, but undeniable truth." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Karoline stepped forward and turned to the gallery. "What you're about to see may be difficult, but I ask that you remember, this is not just about one man. It's about everyone who ever begged for fairness and found only silence." The courtroom dimmed as the screen flickered on. And then, video footage, a hidden recording, time-stamped, authenticated. Sinclair, sitting at a mahogany dining table in a lavish private club, was mid-conversation. "Look, if I dismiss the case quietly, there's no ripple effect. You get what you need. I get what I deserve. Everyone wins." The other man, a CEO previously sued for employee abuse, responded, "Your Honor, you've been very cooperative. The Cayman account will reflect that by next week." Gasps swept through the courtroom, but Karoline wasn't done. She handed over the banking records. Dozens of transfers from shell corporations to accounts tied to Sinclair's daughter, brother-in-law, and even a real estate fund registered to a Delaware P.O. box. "This," she said, holding up one final piece of paper, "is a confession from one of Judge Sinclair's clerks. Signed, sworn, and delivered under the protection of whistleblower status." The judge read it silently. Her eyes widened. Her hand trembled slightly. Then she looked to Sinclair. "Do you wish to respond, Mr. Sinclair?" But Sinclair didn't answer, because he couldn't. He sat hunched in his chair, breathing shallow, sweat dotting his forehead. The arrogance was gone. The denial had died. His lips moved, just barely. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." Karoline stepped forward. "Your Honor, it didn't get this far. He drove it this far. Over years, over ruined families, over silenced truth." She looked around the courtroom, her voice now loud enough for everyone to hear. "Justice is not a commodity. It's not something to be bought or bartered. Justice is sacred, and today," she paused, every eye locked on her, "justice is taking its place back." Suddenly, movement at the door. 2 federal agents entered, badges visible, eyes hard. They approached the bench. "Judge Sinclair," one of them said, voice crisp, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice, judicial bribery, and financial fraud." The courtroom gasped again, but this time it was cathartic. The fall of a tyrant. Sinclair slumped as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. For the first time in decades, he wasn't behind the bench, but before it. And Karoline? She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood there, calm, collected. The image of a woman who had kept her dignity, not just in the fight, but through the fire. As Sinclair was led away, a sound began to rise from the gallery. It wasn't applause. Not yet. It was weeping, soft at first, from a woman in a lavender scarf, clutching a photo of her late son, from a man in a faded bomber jacket, saluting in silence, from a group of elderly veterans who had driven 12 hours overnight to be there in person. Robert Davis, a 90-year-old Korean War vet, stood with trembling legs. "Karoline," he said, voice shaking, "you didn't just expose a man. You restored our faith. You fought for the justice we bled for." That's when the first clap came, then another, and another, until the courtroom was a standing ovation, not for a show, not for a politician, but for a citizen who remembered what truth looked like. The next few days were unlike anything Karoline had experienced. She had faced crowds before, at rallies, in press rooms, on stages. But this was different. This was America answering back. Tens of thousands of letters flooded in, most handwritten, most from names she'd never met, but stories she'd never forget. An elderly couple from Ohio sent a worn photograph of their daughter who died in a botched surgery. "The hospital was protected by Sinclair," the note read. "We didn't have money for lawyers, but your courage gave her a voice." A retired pastor from Alabama wrote in flowing cursive, "You reminded us that truth is not dead. It's just been waiting for a champion." And then there was the letter from 87-year-old Lorraine Hastings, who had marched with Dr. King and later lost her husband to a workplace accident dismissed by Sinclair. "I've waited half a century to feel heard again," Lorraine wrote. "Today, I do." Karoline sat in a sunlit room for a special televised broadcast. No makeup crew, no speechwriters, just her and the letters. She opened one with trembling fingers. She read aloud. "Dear Karoline, I'm 81. My son died 25 years ago. They told me it was an accident, but I knew the company was guilty. We never got justice. But you made me believe again." Tears welled in her eyes, but she kept reading. Another letter, another name, another wound finally acknowledged. She folded the last one and looked up into the camera. "To America. To everyone who wrote to me, prayed for me, stood with me, I thank you." She paused, breath steady. "Your stories reminded me that justice isn't just a courtroom decision. It's a promise, a sacred promise that truth is still worth fighting for." She held up a photo. It was of a little boy, Matthew, the firefighter's son, standing beside his mother at one of the rallies. "I don't want this fight to end with me. I want it to grow, to reach more people, to defend the silenced, to honor the fallen." Then she leaned in. No cue cards, no teleprompter, just her. "Your beliefs matter. Your voice matters. And together, we make sure integrity stays louder than corruption." There was a pause. Then she added softly, Stand with us. The fight's not over, but we're not alone. That night, thousands of elderly viewers, sitting in their homes, clicked the subscribe button with tears in their eyes. They didn't feel like passive viewers anymore. They felt like citizens again. They shared their own stories. They sent in their own memories. They lit candles for justice, for truth, and for one woman who reminded them that courage still lives. And across the country, something began to shift. Not in headlines, not in polls, but in hearts. In the quiet courage of the forgotten. In the rising voice of the overlooked. In the undeniable truth that justice may be delayed, but it is never truly defeated.